Good morning, Dr. Brad.
Kurt Doolittle with fresh coffee. Mine is just finishing brewing. It's very exciting to sit down again for this fine episode number 2084.
And if I recall correctly, you had a whole lot of stuff to discuss today.
There is a whole lot of stuff, but the coffee's almost done. It's like when the coffee's done, I go get it, and then we can begin. But in the meantime, that's a hint for everybody to push that button there, like, subscribe, and notifications, and leave your little messages for us to read. We love them. This was an interesting week, and it's like
oh my God, it was crazy.
And it will get crazier next week, which is the last week, full week before we have our electoral processes, as the powers that be attempt to sway the electorate.
What's it's the first or second Tuesday in November? When is it?
On that 8th, I believe. The election.
Okay, so.
Okay, there's a coffee.
It's an interesting world right now. There's certainly no shortage of entertainment.
Right. And so I had a conversation with my business associate, which made me laugh because he said, this is the rough quote. He says, I used to think I might be a white supremacist, but then I decided I'm just a Western Christian supremacist.
That's correct.
And it's like, and it's provable that that's a why.
Well, I mean, you're only left with a question then, is that who wants to integrate into that and not? I'm not a favor of as an Anglo, the dilution of my people hasn't exactly been good for me or the rest of the country. But, excuse me, the Anglos and the Germans, because that's who populated most of the country. But anybody who wants to get on board, I guess I'm okay with. It's the people who don't want to get on board with responsibility that bothers me.
Right. It's a quite an interesting problem. It is the issue of people. It's the dilution of it is it's just class generating a larger underclass.
Yes,
that's the dilutionary problem, because there's qualified people of every stripe to fill in needed positions inside that structure.
well, sure. I mean, the problem is really it's one is the differences. How big is the difference? Two is the rate, the cultural difference. Two is the rate. In other words, how many of them can we absorb at one time? And three is the class. Now, of those, the class is the biggest problem. All right, because it's what inhibits the rate of integration or the willingness to integrate. So
probably both.
Right. And so the thing I've seen in my lifetime is religion is the big thing. If you're not Christian, it's a fucking problem. For speaking as a WASP who was raised mostly Catholic, I mean, I can't really argue that I'm sort of a product of both churches. It was really obvious to me how damaging the Catholics originally were, but it's been interesting how valuable the Catholics have become. Because Catholicism is actually a better institutional religion for education, and it's actually more westernized than Protestantism, which is surprising because Catholicism is very has all this dogma and church and stuff, right? And Protestantism seems to be more about Jesus, but Protestantism is also eventually more Hebrew, and Catholicism is more European. And this sort of the sort of inverse overlap, the way they solve the both problems, is just very odd to me. But Catholics were a hell of a problem, because not because of Catholicism, but because Catholics were the underclass and Protestants were the upper classes. And so it caused a huge problem. Obviously, the Jewish problem wasn't a problem until the post-war, because if you knew pre-war Jews, I mean, they might as well have been Scots. They were, we were getting so that we could let Jews into country clubs because they were so well integrated. They were even having Christmas, except they had a 6-pointed star instead of a 5, right? So it was working out fine. It's been the post-war Jews the problem. Muslims don't appear to be able. I don't want to overstate this, but the Muslim lower classes are extremely harmful, and now that doesn't seem to be terribly easy to fix. So the thing is, the Hispanics are largely from the lower classes, but they're Christian and they fit in just fine. So it's just the problem turns out to be our white women, right? It turns out to be Jewish intellectuals and white women are the ones that the real problem. Which why is that so ironically humorous? Why is that so funny? We have the black community, right? And I totally get how life sucks at the bottom, right? It's not rebelling against life sucking at the bottom is okay. How can we help these people? Because I'd rebel too. But when you're not at the bottom, when you're as privileged as white women and privileged as Ashkenazi Jews, what's your excuse for undermining? I just think it's hysterical. The irony of this whole thing is just beyond me.
To maintain control, I think. It's continuous upheaval to maintain control.
Yeah, but it's just attention. I'm not even sure it's control. It's attention. And so they're trying to get attention by the exercise of a destructive means of attempting to seize control. But I think the motivation's attention. And now excuse me, because it's not clear that they actually control anything. They just undermine. So their only exercise of control is undermining. It's not constructive. Or they're trying to achieve a good. It's undermining. And so I keep looking at this. I'm like, I'm saying this because I'm not certain, right? I'm saying this because it's clear to me how much the attention problem drives the feminine mind. See, I did it again. I said female, and then I switched to feminine. And I, why? It's because I was looking at your eyes, and I said, "Oh, he's going to correct me if I don't correct myself." So,
good work.
So
you put out an autocorrect on now. So, nice.
Because I really there's every time it's harder with women because there's no record of women's behavior is assumed. But if you look at the complaints against Jewish behavior, is they always will gravitate for something that creates the maximum amount of human verbal interaction. So like when the Russians gave them land, they still gravitated towards selling alcohol, prostitution, gambling, and trading, right? And so because that's what's interesting, right? I mean, that's fulfilling. But and we know what the problem with the women is they need that attention to feel engaged. And why is that? Because interpersonal attention is the highest means of stimulation humans can have, right? It turns on the most Christmas lights, so to speak. So I'm just trying to figure out if it's really a search for power, or if it's the search for attention that is facilitated by the search for power. Does that make sense?
The search for attention is the power.
Yes,
The attention is the power.
right. But it's not that they want power to do. They just want attention, right? It's because attention gives them power. So this is another confirmation of I don't want to say live in the moment, but experiential thinking. And I'm trying to work on this concept, because the more I study it, the more it turns out to be just attention. And attention is just turning on a lot of Christmas lights in the neural economy. And the more empathic you are, the more lights it'll turn on. So I'm just wondering if that's, because that's that's the feminine cognitive bias. Well, it's not true. It's the female bias that express in the feminine biases. Yeah, so it's just interesting. And I'm just trying to, because I keep looking at it as like all you guys ever do is undermine. Right. And you use attention seeking.
The undermining gathers the attention.
Right. The undermining is what produces the attention.
So they have to first draw attention to the fact that they project malevolence on the thing they're undermining.
Right.
And then they gather attention by undermining and drawing attention to that,
right,
which they wish to undermine.
And it doesn't require you don't need innovation or creativity. You just need, right? You just need to maintain emotional consistency. This is why they're illogical. They don't have to be logically consistent. They just have to maintain attention. So all they do is search for whatever will get attention. It's the dumbest fucking algorithm in the world, right? I mean, it's just, but it works.
Well, it works pretty well.
Yeah. And so that insight is very powerful, because it doesn't require any consciousness at all. It doesn't even require you learn anything. It's just the brain organization. And so if you're going to get people who breed for exceptionalism, right? They're going to breed exceptionalism in their cognitive bias. And so that's what we see. So you say, why did women and Jewish people never produce anything except undermining? Well, the answer is really obvious, because it's not about producing anything. It's about getting attention, and undermining is the best way to get attention if you can't innovate. Whereas for men, we have to innovate.
Right. So the guys who stayed in their the ghetto, that were being the orthodox type, or not attention seeking enough. So they sort of are they're left behind in the attention seeking marketplace.
I don't know if I understood what you said there. What I know is that the Jews asked for ghettos, right, quarters, so they could maintain their own customs and laws and traditions. But their customs and laws and traditions are feminine, which maximize human interaction. In other words, Jewish traditions are all feminine. They're all, I mean, they call it man, but if you watch how Jewish men behave in groups, it's like women, it's female behavior. So it's very attention seeking. All the feminism, all the talking, all the teaching, all of it. It's just it's very verbal, interactive behavior. It's not mechanical. Whereas European males give us an excuse to put two widgets together to make a third, and we'll think, it'll happen. It's like the phenomenon that I always just think is hysterical is, why do guys buy Harleys? Because you never have to stop working on them. Right? I mean, it makes no fucking sense, right? Buy a Japanese bike. But no, that's not fun, right? Why buy a 67 Camaro? So you can work on it. Why take up woodworking? So you can work on it, right? Because it's fun. It turns on Christmas lights to work on it. Why do I do my shit, right? It turns on fucking Christmas lights.
Right.
So I mean, it doesn't make any difference. So I'm just, the insight I've had, and I'm working on, I haven't had it, but I'm running it by you right now, which is what I'm doing. is that attention is enough to drive, demand for attention is enough to drive the behavior if and undermining is the least costly means of obtaining attention at the lowest cost. In other words, you don't have to invent, you don't have to produce, you don't
Must
need,
be, must be.
it's just cheap. Words are cheap. So undermining is the cheapest way of obtaining attention. It's a horrible algorithm. We need to get God, we need to get a conference call with God and say, what the fuck, man? What are you up to here? He's like,
God knows what he's doing.
I know. I know what the answer would be is we had to control men.
It's like the men have to be, the undermining is necessary to cause the men to draw sharper boundaries.
Yes.
And it's like, well, we let it get out of control by accident because we couldn't even imagine what was coming out of the bottom.
No. Anyway, so, you could have that's the problem when you get a good God on a con call, right? You got on the con call and he's like, well, you're not thinking this through, Beth. You're right, but you ain't thinking it through. I've got to deal with both sides of the scale, and you're not thinking both sides of the scale. I am.
Right.
You're thinking that there's a way for a thing to know what it is, what to do. It's without a limit that's being proposed by the opposite. And God always has that answer. And he always hangs up early because he doesn't have time to waste on the
I don't have time for this call. That's it. That's it. God hates being on hold, man. That's all right.
I just wish you'd answer the goddamn phone more often.
I understand you. I don't know if he likes the way you refer to that phone.
I don't know. I think he finds me rather
charming and amusing.
Comical.
There you go, right? Boy, oh boy. So here's a question. It's like, is we are talking about elites and pseudo elites. So how do we distinguish between these two? I don't think this is a hard question, but it's perhaps worthy of some consideration.
I know Brad has a theory.
Well, I like the theory that I'd go with is that the pseudo elites, and I think Turchin will call them elites, but they're credentialed individuals that are they have no competency to speak of.
The credentialed incompetent.
Yes.
Whereas the uncredentialed competent, or the demonstrated competent.
Right.
This is a real problem because our whole education system is based on whatever will reinforce credentialism, despite the fact that it doesn't seem to play out. There's also this intersects with the problem of IQ.
Okay.
This is I'm loath to say Taleb has anything right to say about this. But the problem of IQ is that what IQ really does above a certain level is give you access to error and access to deceit. And so I'm not really sure. Right. So there's three dimensions. You can work really hard with IQ on a problem and create something useful. You can detect more errors. You can work really hard on a problem. You can do more associations. In other words, you can broaden the field of opportunities to choose from, the field of possibilities to choose from.
Right.
You can detect more errors, and you can invent more falsehoods, lies. You can be cunning. I didn't write that down, so hopefully I'll find that one of the times I review this. But intelligence gives you those four dimensions. So it's work and responsibility, and evasion of work. You sort of get the three dimensions there. evasion of work responsibility. So the problem is we're not necessarily solving for competency, right? And that the reason that is because competency is only demonstrated in some sort of production. And when I say production, I'm including organization of people towards successful ends. And so what happens is that people who become very bright get into a discipline that they master and they think generalizes, and it doesn't. And so, or they use abstract rules and goods, and they don't understand that people won't actually do that.
Right.
And so, what I've learned running companies, which is what happens to a lot of us, and it happens in your profession, you have to deal with individuals, but in mine, I have to run businesses, and I've run, retail business, and I've run top end consulting firm, and it's the same fucking problem. I mean, you have some distribution of humans.
Right.
On one end, it's, kids who barely can get into college, and the other end, it's kids who graduate from top universities. So, or top technical universities. So you have this huge spectrum, and you realize that they all operate by the same rule, which is incentives. They might have slightly different incentives because they have different senses of security. But I mean, if you're in the military, right?
Right.
Right. So when was the last time we had an Eisenhower or a Schwarzkopf? We haven't.
Right.
We haven't. Now, why? Because Schwarzkopf has fucking 170 IQ. Okay. So what's preventing 170 IQs from entering the military?
Got better opportunities.
They got better opportunities because they're not paying people with 170 IQs to go into the fucking military.
No.
Right. The second thing is, would you rather be governed by somebody who like Obama, who went through the education system with no demonstrated competency, or someone like Norman Schwarzkopf or Dwight Eisenhower or Jimmy Doolittle, for that matter, who went up to the military system and where there's no forgiveness, people die. There's no how there is very. They've made, the Clinton began the ability to make politics in the military, and Obama amplified it.
Yep.
And now we're the problem where we've got a political military where the soldiers won't sign up anymore because they don't respect the people above them. And there's a reason they don't respect the people above them, because the people above them don't deserve respect. Right. And there's another problem, whereas there's a big difference between battlefield commanders. No, basically up to captain, those are soldiers. After that, I don't know what the fuck they are, and neither do the staff. Right. So we have a whole lot of guys who are administrative and some people who are.
That's right.
And so we don't separate the military into, like the Germans did, into different categories, so that a field military is where the promotions come from. Right. If you haven't proven yourself in the capacity to, if we can't demonstrate, how to run, how to come up with strategies and manage men, then your logistics. Now, logistics is important, but it's an aspect. It's not where the skill comes from the people.
That's right.
And God knows how many jokes we have about the people, how many guys at the Pentagon, does talk about what shape a paperclip has to be. So the Israelis have shown how military acquisition has to be done. So we have that reform. The Ukrainians have shown how light infantry reform has to be done, right? That's the other thing. And so the Americans, we have one skill, and that's logistics. That's still right. We have more money to invest in technology, but the acquisitions program since the 1990s has failed, right? It's everything, every program we've put out has failed. And because it went the wrong direction, which is, I mean, ships we don't need, tanks we're not going to use, or whatever. But our missile defense has gone the right way, except we just launched hypersonic missiles this week. So I guess the point I'm making is those men that are in field command positions, they know how to run. People who run industries, they know how to manage people. But the minute your job is political or financial, it's not clear you know how to manage people. And therefore, if you can't manage people, why do you think you have say in government? So this is the point of the difference between credential and demonstrated. It'd be nice if your credentials were validated by demonstrated. In other words, we gave people, this is what we used to do, give people credentials so they could enter a field where it could be demonstrated, i.e. officers, doctors, priests, right? So that was the entry to a demonstrated competency. But what's happening is we're not putting people into demonstrated competency, right? Before they get into positions of authority. And so we've got, I mean, look at Clinton's, not Clinton, who's the current president? Biden's cabinet is like the rainbow clown. The rainbow clown. I mean, look at the woman he has a press secretary. I mean, it's offensive to me. It's
a joke. It's not offensive to me in the least place. It's like Saturday Night Live writ large.
Okay. So why is that? It's because we've started relying on credentialism. And this is the problem all the way through the system.
It is. This goes to the vocabulary word, which I have mentioned before. Which
sorry, can I finish?
Sorry, no. Carry on.
Just one point is that, well, the reason this is important is meritocracy limits the number of elites you can produce, whereas credentialism doesn't. And so it's not just credentialism, it's that you can produce an unlimited number of credentialists, but you can't produce an unlimited number of demonstrated competencies. People with demonstrated competency.
I'm writing this down.
So it's a filter.
That's right.
You know, it's like that. That's why you used to go in the military. The British, I mean, the way you got, rose your ranks is you went in the military because you could demonstrate competency. Right. So that's why you wanted to go in, because demonstrating competency is how you went. Well, of course, that ended up being, with our business and industry being a little too militarized, which wasn't good. But and then so the clerical group came in and they tried to make it hyper efficient, which made work unbearable. The clerices who did that, not the other people. The cleric, in other words, the credentialists did that. Whereas so people who run soldiers know perfectly well how people behave, right? People who run businesses know perfectly well how people behave. But these people came in with, these credentialists came in with theories. Now, the one I use is the Boston Consulting Group invented consulting as we understand it. And they almost killed, I don't know how many businesses they almost killed before we turned that around in the 70s. So we went for, we went for a generation of structuring Western business to fail by trying to bring the Soviet model that credentialists were advocating into the business world under the false promise that would lead to better ends. And of course it didn't. It led to an uncompetitive America against Japan, where Japan came back and said, let's do this just-in-time thing because it's hyper adaptive. And then we adapted that, right? So there's credentialists are a fucking problem. And we need, it's not only, so you get someone out of school who has a theoretical education, no experience, having influence over people who live real lives, right? It's a church.
Yes.
credentialism has to be a church because it's not scientific. It's not, the people aren't demonstrating.
Faith-based.
Yes. And it turns out it's false. So it's when people say, can we fix this problem? I mean, if you understand the problem, you can fix it. But if you don't understand the problem, you can't. Now, what's the difference? You can't manufacture political competency. You can only learn it, develop it, right? So that's why we get credentialism, as we have too many assumptions about what credentialism can do versus what demonstrated competency. And that leads to the overproduction of pseudo elites, pseudo intellectual pseudo elites across the spectrum who have no choice but faith. This is important. They don't have any choice but faith for two reasons. First reason is that
go ahead.
First reason is they don't have the experience otherwise. In other words, there's no falsification available to them. And if there is falsification, it's beyond their feedback horizon. And the second reason is their status is predicated on coming up with some new bullshit that shows that they're contributing to the credential cycle, which is my favorite example is, why is there a PhD in education? These people are producing oceans of nonsense that have only made education worse because that's the credential test. But the fact is, teaching isn't a skill, it's a talent. You can learn to teach in 6 months because it's really simple. But can you do it? Well, that's a different thing, right? You might learn to get better, but either you have the capacity to keep track of 30 minds in your fucking classroom and figure out how to get each one of those minds from wherever it is in the Markov chain of the state machine that is whatever curriculum you're trying to get across, right? And whatever distribution of lesson plans you're working on, right? Either you can figure out how to get mind A from point A to point B this time, or you can't. And some teachers are like, I'm so good, I can get 90% of my students with one story from A to B. And some teachers are, I have no idea about the mind of my students. I'm just getting in, and I'm blaming them for not working hard enough if they don't make it. So I made my extra point there. I'm sorry. I just wanted to get closure on that issue.
Well, that's good. I was driving to work yesterday with the news from this week, and it was very disturbing. This projected shortfall in diesel availability coming in the next 30 days. And I was like, it's like we are being governed by absolute incompetence.
Yes.
They are not qualified to govern this because they're running into the dirt. And it goes to this, which is, it's malarchy, not malarkey. It is government by the bad. These people are just bad.
That's funny. The malarchy. I like that.
But the issue is this. I think the dictionary misspelled it on purpose so we don't think about it. Because it's government by the bad, malarchy. And it's like, what an awful circumstance. Because it's like this. It's like, how do you have to try to not pay attention to the dial to recognize that the diesel's running out. Why is the diesel running out? I couldn't figure it out. We were looking at the production figures for various petroleum distillates yesterday, and we were unable to detect why. It's like, are you just exporting it all? I mean, why? How can it possibly be true? I can't imagine it, because the production didn't go down significantly enough. It's like, where did it go? It's very curious to me how this even came to be a possibility.
Well, the number in this particular case, the number of interests are, in other words, there are people who are doing this because they don't understand. There are people that do this because they're seizing a profit because they think no one else will, but everybody else will. And there are people who are constructing this problem so that they can make a profit. And there are people constructing this problem so they can teach a lesson. In other words, so a tendency of the human being, which one of the things we're trying to change among human beings, is they're not enumerating right? Enumerate, serialize, disambiguate, right? Disambiguate by enumeration, serialization, operationalization. We don't need to serialize this, right? There's nothing to serialize. We just look at, we need to enumerate the interests, and there's a lot of interests in there.
Yeah.
And the average person thinks of one interest and they stop there, and then they blame that group. Well, you know,
Right.
there's all sorts of problems. I mean, the fundamental problem is the left, the environmentalist left has a chokehold on the Biden administration, and so the Biden administration can't solve the domestic price problem, which causes pain to the mass of the population, which makes the environmentalists happy, which reinforces the because remember, the environmentists, they're like foot soldiers to the Democratic Party, right? So there's like they're like environmentalists are for the left, like Christians are for the right. I mean, it's just, if you can get the foot soldiers going, you'll get change. So I mean, there's a lot of interests conflicting here, and so the real problem is this a strategic asset? Yes. So why doesn't the government know the list of strategic assets?
Just watch it like a fuel gauge.
We need to know. I mean, we got rid of medicine, right? Medical supplies we ran short of. We don't have enough arms, and we don't have enough fuel. Right? We have tanks. We have excess tanks because it keeps people employed. But we don't have missiles, except there's no value. I mean, as we've just seen, you need a lot of missiles. You don't need too many tanks, right? We don't need too many tanks. We got the best tanks in the world. I mean, there's no, Leopard maybe, but that's it, right? But you need, for one tank, which is 10 million. Our tanks are 10 million, right? Russia's are 3 to 5, right? You have $10 million tank there. Yeah, but what we need is $200,000 missiles. I need a shitload of $200,000 missiles, and we don't have them. We don't have them because it doesn't create 6 million jobs. It creates another 50 jobs at Raytheon, right? Which I'm sort of, my father's best friend is senior exec there, so I have a long-term insight into Raytheon. So, which is a fascinating old company,
right?
Right? Or what's the other one? It's trying to make you need a year and a half to expand production of the HIMARS spectrum.
Oh,
a year and a half. You can't have a year and a half time lag in a modern war to increase production.
Come as you are. It's come as you are, man.
Right, and we have 30 to 60 days worth of ammunition. So I mean,
it's incompetency.
It's income statement versus balance sheet. In other words, if they're not managing the balance sheet and they're managing the income statement, it looks like they're competent. But the minute you look at the balance sheet, you realize they're incompetent. If you looked at the balance sheet, you'd see bowling alone was costing us more than Social Security. You know, the effect of bowling alone is profound. If you looked at the balance sheet, you'd see what credentialism is doing. It's making the richest people in the world people that are non-performing in the greater Washington area.
Yeah.
And so, and if you look at the balance sheet, you would see that offshoring all this work has hollowed out the center of the country. Well, that's going to come back now, but you know, that should have never happened. What should have happened, of course, is that the unions were causing capital flight.
Right.
And so the capital flew. Right. So we should have stopped the unions from stop. You can make a union if you want, but we got to fire you too. But the minute I can't fire you, collective bargaining, that means that you have the ability to interfere in the strategic capacity of the state. So they cause that. Well, we don't keep a balance sheet, which is what I teach, right? Keep a balance sheet. Not the income statement doesn't matter. It's noise. It's the balance change in the balance sheet that matters. But if you run your government as a balance sheet under the presumption of infinite growth, you're not going to look at the balance sheet. But instead, if you run a balance sheet under the presumption that the income statement is noise, you're going to actually continue to make good decisions. So short-term thinking, credentialist thinking, false promise of endless growth, and basically post-war neoliberal optimism or utopianism. It's fucking it's literal. In retrospect, it's crazy. I was sort of going off on my favorite, one of my favorite intellectuals of Sabine Hossenfelder today.
Yes.
Because she's outside of her lane. I'm like, I'm not saying outside. Well,
what did she do?
Yeah, she's trying to expand out of just criticism of physics, math, right? And so she's adding new things. Well, of course, as you do that, the problem is your competency doesn't transfer, right? It doesn't scale or transfer. And so if you start out with her reasoning, which is mathematical skepticism, right? She's correct, right? In physics, she's correctly identified the problem of what we call, she calls prettiness, right? Elegance in mathematics, which is really simplicity. And she said that drive is caused all sorts of problems in mathematics. And then secondly, people make unscientific claims in order to get public attention.
Right.
This confuses the public that this stuff is other than fantasy. It's like philosophy is fantasy moral literature, and most popular science is fantasy science literature. It's just nonsense, right? We haven't really made much progress outside of genetics and cognitive science since the 70s. So what are these physicists doing? They're demanding more money and giving more promise and building these stories, but the truth is we haven't made this. So she's out on this thing. And I'm like, yeah, the difference though is in physics and math, you have a certain kind of certainty in your mind. But when you study economics, which is what I studied first, right?
Right.
I studied economics, you realize, shit, math doesn't fucking work.
It doesn't.
Right? That's the first thing you learn. The second thing you learn is math doesn't work. There's a very low limit to the capacity of mathematics. We can do more elaborate math, but the more elaborate it gets, it turns out the worse, the more our results deviate, because the more assumptions are multiplied by every layer of abstraction. Right? So you basically, anything you do in economics that is terribly elaborate in the sense of derivations turns out to be false. What you want instead is multiple axes of competing information whose conflicts tell you something. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so as an economist, what you learn is if you're a labor economist, you have no fucking idea about financial economics. And anything, so that's what's really, that when you say economists agree, that's a stupid statement, because there's probably 3 guys who actually know enough about
to have an opinion.
Whereas if you ask the field of economists, they all are going to answer, well, given what I know, except none of the laws are generalizable down in, right? It's the same reason mathematics isn't generalizable down into computation. In other words, mathematical reducibility is limited. Well, it's the same thing for conceptual reducibility in economics. It's limited because as you go down in the scope, the aggregates disappear and the particulars start to appear. Right. And so you play with this problem. So in economics, we're very aware of, well, I mean, this guy's really good in that field, and my instinct would tell me that, but it turns out it's just the opposite, because that's what happens. Is almost everything you look at, your skill applied to this domain turns out to be inverted or non-applicable, because that's not, those causal factors aren't what's causal factor there.
They don't occur at that granularity.
Right, because the operations are different. So the permutations are different. All right. So I'm going over her thing today. I'm like, so what she's complaining about is what's called long-termism, which is that, and I'm like, it's clear she's not a student of economics,
because what all a long-termist is saying is that there's a diminishing return on trying to improve the quality of life of the individual in the moment, such that all our attempts are actually producing retrogressions, regrade. In other words, everything we're doing is to try and improve the quality of life of most people now is actually increasing the hazard that they'll do worse things, obesity and whatever, right? This kind of crap. Right. So it's that's counterintuitive, right? But it's actually true, is that you at some point you're not removing hazards, you're encouraging them.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Well, so what happens is what's your best move is to move capital, in other words, investment, out into more obvious catastrophic things. So what all the long-termists are saying is that you can have all these crises in the middle, and we're not going to stop hurricanes and volcanoes and whatever, but we're also not going to stop people from being stupid. In fact, what we're doing is we're encouraging people to be stupid, like living in a hurricane zone or living on the beach. Or I mean, these are great things that you're buying a risk with. Well, we could stop that, of course, but you don't want to. People don't want us to. Okay, fine. Well, then they're choosing to be stupid. Okay, fine. You can't fix that problem, really. But can we increase the number
People prefer to be stupid.
Can we get better at asteroids, diseases, volcanoes, sun flares in our electrical system? In other words, can we look at these long-term things instead of worrying about these shorter-term things? And of course we can, because that's whatever you do, right? When you've exhausted the returns on this production cycle, you move the production cycle out at further a time, right? Well, that's all we do, right? What does interest do? When you borrow money at interest, you're just extending the duration of the production cycle so that you can get greater efficiency, right, from a larger scale. Well, it's the same thing with protecting against I mean, we should be doing that. We should be looking at space exploration. How long is it going to take us to figure out how to make a ship that can actually travel in space, right? Well, it's going to take a long fucking time, right? Because only one place that I know of there's energy left to exploit, because fusion isn't going to work. So it's going to, and that problem looks really fucking hard. Right? I mean, it looks like a really, really, really hard problem. So what about material science? How do we get to where we have something as harder than a diamond, but as tolerant as, I don't know, carbon,
Right.
So, I mean, how do we get that kind of thing? How do we find an element in the universe that stores more energy than the ones that we currently experience as radioactive decay? Is that possible? I mean, there's just all this stuff out there. Because why? Is because those things of that scale can wipe out humanity. A hurricane in Louisiana can't.
It's merely annoying.
Right. That's all they're trying to say. But she's trying to cast it as like it's carelessness. I mean, no, it's just the way you explain the problem that way. And so, I mean, even the best of us, and I consider her one of the better public intellectuals, we get it outside of our lane and we say stupid things. If we could teach more people what we do, we'd have fewer people saying stupid things.
I was like this, it's like what? So we go back to this falsehoods, and I looked at the post-war settlement, which is since World War II, and the exhaustion of opportunities for fakery and credentialism is upon us.
Yes.
This is about where we're at, because it's like the credentialist like House of Cards is now exceeding its capacity for being built up as much as it is, and it's going to come cascading down because it's simply not competent.
Correct.
And it's like, so the exhaustion of opportunity is here, and you wonder, I was wondering this with the energy, is how much of the energy bonus, from the exploitation of oil in the 20th century we're exhausting that opportunity to use as a bridge to carry us to the next source of energy, which that's troubling.
Well, we have nuclear energy, and contrary to, so, I mean, again, Sabine went out on the limb on this one. Theoretically, you can refine nuclear fuel infinitely, right? I mean, we don't refine, and then what you do is you encase it in glass, and what's left, it doesn't go anywhere. You don't have to, it's not a problem. But you can basically refine this stuff infinitely, which is what nuclear engineers are always saying. I don't know why they're talking about. You can refine this shit infinitely until it's, so, but it's also a limited fuel on the planet. In other words, if we scale up nuclear power, we start to have the same problem we've had with oil. So we had a problem with trees. now we had a problem with coal, and now we're having a problem with oil. Then we're going to have a problem with nuclear energy. So we have to find, the only thing we can't run out of is solar. So that's the end result. But then solar isn't scalable, or it is only N scalable.
N1.
Right. And so you can't get more than there is. And so these are real problems we have to solve because we go out of it. Now, the thing that I wish I could get into the popular vernacular, the popular concept is that if you look, this is a great piece that came out this week in this, by the way, is that the energy, is that standard of living is a reflection of energy consumption per person.
Right.
Which should be obvious, right?
It seems straightforward.
It seems, right? So the only way to keep increasing quality of life is keep increasing the energy consumption. It's really energy transformation.
That's right.
Per person, right? And so because that's essentially energy transformation is expression of how it's no different for you and I listing this, right? We ate some food, we digested it, we turned it into energy slow enough that it didn't burn us up, right? Because that's the problem, right? If we could eat faster, we'd just light on fire, right? Why is that so funny to me? I don't know why.
It's just silly. It's just silly.
So there's a ratio of the food we can intake, the oxygen we can intake, and our ability to not start on fire or spontaneous bust, right? So, but I mean, this is just energy, right? I converted energy, right? Well, I mean, what is everything else we do? We convert energy it's just a more elaborate version of lifting this thing up. We're doing this at extraordinary scales. And the second thing, a general rule, which I think people think is a really deep insight. I don't know why, but most of what we do is condense space between things. Well, what does the internet do? Is it condenses space between?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Right. So most of energy savings is created by either bringing people together to decrease the opportunity cost, or decreasing the cost of transportation, which reduces the same thing.
Communication, yep.
Right. And then communication, of course, does this same thing. And the more that we're dependent on communication information instead of actual transport of physical things, in other words, where physical things can stay in place, or today, when I call up I fill out what I want my groceries delivered, and they're here in 45 minutes, right? Or anything I want, I order from Amazon. It gets here because the distributed cost of shipping lots of things, through existing pipelines. So in other words, UPS or whatever, it's really cheap, much cheaper than me trying to figure out how to get something from me to you, which is expensive, right? So what we're doing is compressing time. So if you look at it as we're compressing space and time, and we're replacing it with energy consumption. So the beautiful piece that came out this week, which is hysterical. Was it last week? Anyway, it came out recently, because I've heard it more about it this week, but I seem to recall it coming out like a month or two ago. Is that if you look at the brightness of the nighttime sky around the world, it reflects the GDP of the people, which reflects the energy consumption of the people, which reflects the standard of living. Right. So the argument in this particular piece is the Chinese have been lying to us, because there's no way that much light production is producing 6% per year. It's more like 4%. No, GDP and growth. So they're vastly overstated their economic growth, and they can't. And this particular
economist explained why that was, which was kind of fascinating to read, really. It's a pretty good argument. Can we prove it? I don't know, but it's
interesting
it's an interesting
as a metric, right?
Yeah. So, because China's really poor, right? I mean, it's like India has, has about as India and China both have about as many prosperous people as America, and the rest of the people are poor, right? The problem is getting more than that number of people in each of those countries up from there, right? Whereas it's one thing to get our country up to where it is, right? So what was I trying to make? The point I was trying to make is energy conversion, right? And it's all, so we're limited by these factors. So our long term is limited by the energy conversion per capita. So the only way we can change that is we reduce the number of people to maintain the rate of energy conversion the planet can handle, which is about 1 billion people, which is what everybody said for the past 150 years since Malthus. It's just, you can handle 1 billion people on this planet, and that's about as much as the carrying capacity if you want to maintain energy consumption. And yet we're going to be 10 times that very shortly.
Well, we'll see how this goes.
I gave out 3 algorithms that just now. Did that make sense? Time, space, energy, population.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's just math, right? And so we don't get to have an infinite number of people having an infinite quality of life with infinite security.
Right. And so there's a misstatement that my father used to make, which is like the best, the most good for the most people, or something like that, which has 2 parameters that don't really mix too well. It's like that's not gonna work, man.
Well, I mean, we blew the one thing that was important, which is we blew eugenics because the Nazis. I mean, we let that turn into a negative instead of a positive, which was that all we have to do to make that possible is maintain the genetic capacity of the population in relation to the technology available, which sounds horrible, but it only sounds horrible if all you're telling people is you can only have 1 kid. Right, that's your maximum penalty, right? Or if you're really broken, we have to sterilize you because you're transmitting an extremely costly disease to others, at least to the point where we can fix whatever that genetic defect is. In the case of many very serious genetic defects, it's just 1 correction. So some of those things can be corrected, right?
It seems like most of them will be like multitude of minor defects that are very difficult to get a handle on, like causing some brain problem.
Well, that's the IQ problem. It's just there's too many variables to correct. So you can't really, like, we can't yet. Let's say we could reduce it to, let's say, 100 SNPs. That's probably fixable, at least fixable over generations, right? But I don't, given how that we know it's over 1,000 so far, we are pretty confident it's over 1,000 so far. Fixing the real problem, which is neural adaptation, because we know things like we can get people who don't get build up. When you run, your muscles get tired, you build up what in them that gives you cramps?
Lactic acid.
We know we can stop lactic acid buildup. We know we can make your heart and lungs process vastly more information. We know we can fix kidneys. We know we can fix your liver, right? These things are genetically altered because we found people. We know that we can add more colors to your eyesight, right? We know we can increase your sense of smell, right? These are all things that are possible, right? Those are all good things, but that's not the same thing as right? Because those are actually fairly small numbers.
Right.
It turns out that though fixing your head, which seems to be like its own fucking separate universe, seems to be somewhat difficult. Because if it wasn't, we'd be able to figure it out, right? In other words, we should have some indication by now, but so far it looks like, and we're getting enough data to be able to sort of look at this. It's more than 1,000. God knows. I mean, the problem is, okay, we know that 1,000. No, let's say it's 1,000 something. I mean, no, they're sort of involved somehow. Okay, if I know that you have like our skin color, right? It's four, right? You can change people's skin color with four genetic. I mean, it's fucking trivial, right? What does it change? Well, it changes weird things. Like the great thing about cats is certain
Huh.
cats, if they get blue eyes, they go deaf.
No,
Right? You know, just
that's just weird.
right. Well, it's on the same pathway. Well, most of neoteny on one pathway, right? It's right. So you have all these things that are on multiple pathways. So you can't. So the problem with changing like one thing is it's broken. It's really obvious, right? You can like, what's the sickle cell anemia?
Yeah, yeah.
This should be fixable, right? Vulnerability to malaria should be fixable for the same reason.
Right.
But the flip flop is, how do you fix 1,000 SN? Which of those 1,000 SNPs affects 20 other goddamn things we don't?
Right, because when you fix it, you don't quite know what you're going to get exactly.
Yeah, right, and God knows what happens if we fix these 3 or these 5. I mean, the number of God, who the fuck knows what's going to happen, goes to the roof. So I just think that's a really hard problem. But you know, the flip side is saying we can make people better, and all we got to do largely is stop people with really serious defects from having more than one child.
Right.
Right. I mean, and the problem is that ends up being a race issue because they think it's a race
Looks issue, like a race issue,
but it's not. It's a class issue, right? It's a genetic load issue, but it looks like a race issue because some races have larger lower classes than others. I mean, you know, Africa,
it will be argued by underminers that is what it is.
Right. And it's like, well, and I would, if I were a member of one of those classes, I'd like, shit, that's true, but it sucks. I actually don't get, it's interesting. I have quite a few followers in Africa. I have more Muslim followers than I would have thought, but I have way more African followers than I thought. But Africans are completely realistic. You know, you get the crazy Marxist in Africa like you do anything else, and you get the crazy Muslims in Africa like anything else. But and of course you get the crazy fundamentalist Christians in Africa. I mean, there's crazy people everywhere. But educated Africans are like, shit, I hate that, but it's true. Whereas the white people, they can't it's like, I hate that, so it can't be true. You know, what the fuck is wrong with this?
I mean, a feminine thought right there.
Sorry, I've been on a rant there, but it's an interesting one. Is that the real problem is the great filter is most likely the inability for a population to implement soft eugenics, not hard eugenics.
Right.
Like getting rid of people, but soft eugenics, which is limiting the reproduction. Because if you limit people to one child, you know, eventually the problem gets filtered out of the
right.
You could forbid people from having children, sterilize them. You know,
what you would do is you would create incentives for them to self-sterilize.
Right.
You just make it worth their while, and it's like, okay, that's a good deal.
Yeah, but
it's
a violation of. It's a pretty hard violation of reciprocity to say that, well, you know, you're just less valuable to the. I mean, there gets to, you know, it's got to be a clear thing. Like, look, you know, there's a mental illness problem in your family. Oh, I have a great story about this. A mental illness problem in your family.
Yeah.
We can't fix it, and it's just led to 6 generations of criminality, and so we just got to stop you guys. Out of self-defense, we got to stop you guys. That doesn't mean you can't let the 3 people in the family that don't have those defects.
Yep.
Right, reproduce. You just gotta. It's the same thing with most criminals. I mean, as you look at the number of sociopaths in the fucking prison system, and there's no reason we're not sterilizing those fucking guys the minute we see them, because you actually know who they are by the time they're 12. I mean, what did the guy say to me? Any cop can tell you that you can predict the future of a kid by the age of 7.
Really?
Yeah. Any good cop will tell you. Any career policeman. This is a detective telling you this. He says you can. I caught him just before retirement. Said I was investigating something interesting, and he said, Yeah, you can, any good career policeman, not the people who are just here to do the job, but the people who see it as a career. So you can tell a kid's future by the age of 7. And he doesn't mean it in the sense that you can tell he's going to be a mechanic or you can tell that this kid's a criminal by the age of 7. It's probably true. Seems to be true. So can I go tell a quick story?
Yes.
Oh, this is really funny. So my name's Doolittle, right? And there was a family called Dooley, Dooley. And there was a interesting example of a young girl named Dooley, which I published yesterday because it came out in the newspaper. A girl named Dooley who set up a date on a dating system. Hot, by the way. Hot, very attractive. Reasonably attractive. In other words, she doesn't need makeup or anything. She's a cute little thing, right? Set up a thing, a date. Said she wanted to tie the guy up, right? So tied up his hands and feet, and then serviced him, orally serviced him, and then proceeded to stab him and torture him. All right. Now she's crazy, right? I mean, that's
goes without saying.
That
is just abnormal behavior.
That is fucking crazy. Okay. It's white people crazy too. It's not black people. Black people crazy is impulsive. White people crazy is really fucking scary because white people plan.
Just like, where did that come from, right?
So it's interesting. Her name is Dooley. Now, back in the early part of this last century, when the eugenics movement was on, one of the families studied was Dooley. And they did a circular graph from the first person, it's an old family, and they just did the circular graph of all the people, and they tagged every person who was mentally ill, criminal, etc., with a tag, and they listed over on the side what crime that person had done. And you see that this family is a fucking catastrophe. It doesn't mean there aren't normal people coming out of it, but in this family, whatever's wrong is really fucking wrong, right?
The defect is significant.
Right. So if you look at the amount of harm this one family did, right, because it's producing so many people like her, which is somewhere psychopath,
Yeah.
mentally very dangerous people. And she didn't need trauma to be that way. She's just that way, right? Is you look at how dangerous a generation is, right? Right.
Yep.
And so you look at the cumulative cost of that family over time. Whereas if you went back and you took one person out of there, or it took the atom out of that family back in 1690 or whatever it was, you look at the difference in social, balance sheet change, not
right
income statement, but balance sheet change. Well, so they produced a study, and the Dooley family is going to sue them. So what the fuck to do is they say it's the Doolittle family.
Who did?
What? No, this is the authors did, and they in other words they changed the new name from Dooley to Doolittle.
Oh,
because we're a respected family. In other words, and I'm like, you fuckers, it's not like this thing got sold millions of copies or anything. It's basically a small research paper. But so I have a thing about the Dooley family for this reason. But anyway, I thought that would be a great example of there are female sexual predators just as there are male sexual predators. They're rarer, but that makes them just fucking scarier. I mean, the fact that she set up a dating site, seduced a guy into sex, let
murder him. It's like, wow.
But I won't take it through the wall. But I mean, what she does is it's really psycho. I mean, it's just, it's not like you stab the guy and cut him up into pieces, right? I mean, she drags this shit on. So, I mean, and she's just this little cute little thing,
Oh my.
So anyway, so genes matter. Crazy genes matter a lot.
That was a hard story, Kurt.
The point is that we want to eliminate friction between us people.
Right.
We want to reduce the cost and of worry, of stress, of risk, of everything. And we do this by creating a narrative. Now, some of us are willing to live in the world where that narrative is consistent and correspondent with reality. And some of us like to live in a world that is non-correspondent with reality and not inconsistent with reality, whether it's at the optimistic or the pessimistic extreme. And unfortunately, when it comes to political discussions, by adding women to the polity and adding leftists to the polity, we get feminine fear of policing the commons because they don't want the responsibility and risk of exposing themselves to the hardship of preventing ills by others.
Yeah. That's an interesting, I'm picking up more of this vibration in the conversations, the public conversations about the introduction of women into the polity. It's like an increasing volume of discourse associated with that thought process.
I mean, women were open about it beforehand. They said we don't serve in the military, we can't be and women's nature isn't fit for politics. And if it is, it'll make us not women anymore. Right? We'll start behaving like men. They were right. And I sent out a video this morning by one of the girls I follow in Russia, and she's interviewing Russian women on whether they feel oppressed or discriminated against. And they say, well, I'd rather be a mom, or I'd rather be a mom, but I still want to have a little work so I can buy myself nice things. Or I want to be a mom, but I want to have enough career so I feel fulfilled. But there's no, and she says, but I don't feel discriminated against. I'm sure it'll happen if I get in a career. But they said that usually, and what it came out is, well, we're usually told to be quiet. That's that's actually the right answer. It's that the problem is women tend to put forth opinions that are relevant in the social sphere, which they consider business environment to be part of the social sphere, whereas men consider business to be part of the political sphere. Right, this is the problem, and so you'll see women bringing up things that are social in a political space. That's what happens by the entry of women into the workforce.
So it's a blurring of distinctions.
Right. And so the problem is, my opinion on this is that the truth fixes problems, is that you're trying to insert a social perception into a political, a familial, interpersonal, and social perception into an economic and political domain where it doesn't belong.
Scale error.
Right. Which is fine, but if you just tell women that, I mean, at least my experience is that they don't really care. Right. You're right. They don't really care. The problem is when you say shut up, you're just a woman. Right. It's fucking offensive, but it also doesn't help a man. You understand. Right. It's just being an asshole guy. Right. The problem is guys are assholes because they don't know how to do it better too. Right. I mean, they just don't know. Well, there's the political domain and the interpersonal, the familial, interpersonal, and social domain. And whether you like it or not, economics is war. It's a substitute. Business is a substitute for war. It's the optimum substitute for war. So when you're in your volunteer organization or your church or your social sphere, whatever, that makes sense. But in this sphere, you make a political choice, an economic and political choice, not a social choice. And you can teach women that. I mean, I've done it like for years, right? They're like, oh yeah. And it's not a problem. I mean, I also deal with educated women, but I mean, it's not a problem. And you say to men, you can't say shit like that to women. You're not helping them any, right?
You're only making it worse.
You're only making it worse by making them think they're being oppressed or dismissed or disrespected when it's no, you're talking about, it's like talking about your private sexual matters in a public forum. You don't do that. It's not appropriate. And then the same thing is trying to bring interpersonal attempts at reducing competition into business and politics, where the purpose of competition is a virtue that allows us to continually have this conflict we call economies that produce goods instead of harms. I mean, you're doing the exact worst thing possible by trying to make a business a social environment. You know, most women aren't stupid, right? And most we're just doing the best we can.
Only about half.
Well,
of everybody.
So men are bad and women are evil. Men are stupid and women are crazy.
Okay.
It just seems to be the way it works. And if you get it, if you're stupid and bad and crazy and evil, you know, it just seems to be the way it works.
All right, Kurt, I think we need to take a break.
All right, come back in a minute.
Thank you.
So I guess you buried the body while we were on a break. Is that what happened? So you had a couple of topics this week that I remember. One was about reading strategy.
That's right. You had mentioned that you were talking to me about reading strategy for reading complex books, because we were talking about reading Thomas Aquinas.
Oh yeah, which is difficult.
It is remarkably difficult.
So is Kant. Let's talk about that.
Okay.
Let's do that. That's an interesting thing, because both of them are trying to solve the same problem, which is Aquinas is, both of them is trying to say problem resulted in very complex writing, or complex writing that is difficult to, I find it tiring.
Just like work.
I find my own writing tiring.
We'll ask about that later.
So if you look at Aquinas, he's trying to deal with the fact that Aristotle and the Greeks are being reintroduced into Europe by the Muslim flight from into Europe, bringing Greek literature with them, because the Christians have destroyed so much of it. And the introduction, and realizing how right it is, right? And so he does his job. Kant, which is what does he write down? Forgot 16. Manual Kant. Ow! I can't type.
Uh-oh.
Keep these dates right. So
yeah,
1700s. So he's same time as the founders. So Kant's trying to, well, what's Kant trying to do? He's trying to replace religion. So the Greeks come up with philosophy, which turns out to be the natural religion of Europe. All right, so you have heroic mythology and rational philosophy, opposed to Middle Eastern mythology and theology, as opposed to Chinese, I don't know if we could call it mythology and a reasonable philosophy. Rational, logical, and reasonable philosophy is the best way to distinguish China. And we can't go to India because as much as
talk about that.
I've had some insights here, because what's his name did a nice condensed review. What if Althis just did a nice condensed review of India in 2, and he sort of doesn't quite get there, but it allowed me this headspace to think about it a little bit. But Europe is really you're going to choose between Europe, Middle East, and China as the 3 axes, right?
the 3 points of the compass, and India's in the middle somewhere. So, so both these guys are trying to solve the problem of creating an improved religion, right? And so, I always pick on Kant, right? Because I just see him as silly, right? He's not silly. He's not silly in his ambition. So the difference is he actually set out to do this, and I did it by accident, right? I mean, that's the silly part, is thinking you know the fucking answer, right? And you're going to solve it. And he ends up, well, cognitive rationalism isn't bad, all right? It's just wrong, right? It's in the German school of phenomenalism and experientialism. So you get Hegel and Kant, Hegel, whatever you want to look at. Whereas we get the way I anchor it is we get Aquinas and the scholastics, and then we get Locksmith and Hume, right? And then we get Darwin, Maxwell, and Menger, and the whole freaking lot of them later on. So we get this progression. So the problem is, how do you read this stuff? Like, and the way I do it, because how do I explain this? Like, some people like Martin can see a point of view. They can read Martin when he goes through an author. He can maintain his interprojective, and he can still understand the other person's point of view. And that's how you want to be able. Lindsay does this really well. He understands the other person's point of view, and he maintains detachment from it. When I read something that's not logical, it makes me angry.
Kind of like that too. It's like, son of a bitch, I can't read this crazy shit.
It just makes me pissed because I feel like I have to fix it, right? So when I read Kant, it's not only tedious, it's not only it's hard for me to sympathize with it, in other words, and empathize with it, because I actually find it offensive, right? It's like reading, and so so how do you get over that? And I'm trying to make this funny so I can help the audience. But so the way I do things, if I want to read something, because you're supposed to, one of the things you'll learn in intellectual history is read what the fucking person said, not what people said about him.
Right.
But that makes it, what I find that does is it makes me, it's like reading a mystery novel and you're thinking ahead. Well, when I'm reading that stuff and I start thinking ahead, it just makes me more and more pissed because it's more and more illogical, right, as I go through. But what, so I'm trying to, I hope this humor is coming. I'm trying to make it humorous. But anyway, it's frustrating. But what instead I do is I read, let's say, it used to be encyclopedias. So if I wanted to know about Aquinas, I'd pull out 6 encyclopedias. I read the encyclopedia argument on Aquinas. I mean, I actually remember doing this. I can remember the library I was in, with the shelf that the books were on, and where I was standing. It's funny, right? So you look at it and you read through it, and you read another one, and you sort of just get the general bit. Then, if you can, you go to the equivalent of Cliff Notes, which is summaries. What are Cliff Notes? They're extended encyclopedia entries on it. They're short books on encyclopedia entries, right? And what you've got now is you've got a present frame for understanding the author. And so as you're going along the journey, it's like you already understand the map. All right. And so now you can interpret the author without the annoyance of trying to figure out the mystery as you're going along. And so the way I do it, the next thing I do is I try to find a few popular reviews. All right, not popular,
just
reviews of it. And then and so now I've got different opinions.
Yep.
My favorite way to find that today, since the internet, because before that you couldn't, it was harder. But since the internet's been available, is I go to the section in Wikipedia that says opposing arguments or whatever, or criticisms. And then I go try to find a few things of criticisms of it. So if I want to understand somebody, actually the most important thing I read is the criticisms. Right. And by that time, I've got to where I can go read the book. Because I've got a map of the territory, and I've got a map of the traps.
Right.
Then you take the book and you read the table of contents. Anybody who's worth reading, the table of contents is a summary of the argument.
Right.
And then you randomly pick, the old joke is read page 99.
Okay.
Because page 99 is just turns out to be about where the something smart is being said, because it takes that long to get there. And just read page 99, something around there.
Right.
And then I just sort of read the first paragraph of a few chapters. What I'm really trying to do at that point is, can I put up with this? In other words, is this written in a front foot? And then once I do that, you start at the beginning and you go through, and I usually read it. When I read something, I'll really read the first few paragraphs quickly of each chapter.
Right.
And because here's the truth. If you read enough, everything anybody's going to say is fucking obvious. And the older you get and the more you've read, the more useless. I mean, the truth is,
A lot of talk.
there's a lot of talk in there that can be reduced to a paper.
Yeah.
And so, like, I have this little summary of reduction of Kant somewhere, it's like 6 points. It's like that's all that's going on. And this is how to convert what he says to science, right? I have some post I wrote back in, I don't know, 15 or 16 on it. So the trick is if you sit down and say, I'm going to endure this book, right? Whereas instead of saying, I'm going to look up these encyclopedia, because today you can do it all from the internet. You can read the encyclopedia entries, the Wikipedia entry, right? You can look under the criticisms. You can go look up those criticisms. You can index a few things, right? You can look for the paper with the most cites, right? As most of you know, what I do is I read textbooks, right? So I'll just go read the whole fucking textbook, right? Because a textbook is essentially encyclopedia form for a concept. In other words, it's tends to be neutral. And then you get into the author, and by that time, the author's craziness is mediated by it, so that you're able to see it. And so it's at that point you can read someone like Nietzsche, and you'll see the genius. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? You'll see these little fucking things he says. It's like, Jesus. Or these things Kant says. Well, his genius isn't like Nietzsche's. It's spread over this much text, and Nietzsche's spread over this much text. Nietzsche has some pretty quotable genius shit in there that's like volumes of human knowledge condensed into some little saying, right?
Right.
You don't find too much of that in Kant, but you get his basic principle, which is, okay, the reduction of religion is the golden rule, which is tell the truth at all times, right? Don't do anything to anybody you wouldn't want done unto you. And unfortunately he's tried to create a psychology, which is his method of epistemology. It can be easily converted to science, which I've done elsewhere if you want to look at it. Categories. So he wasn't even far off.
No.
But if you try to read an Aquinas without doing what I just said, it's
a morass.
It's a morass. And so what people say is, Kurt, you just told me I have to do a lot of work. No, I'm saying you give yourself a ladder to climb that reduces the friction of reading the author's work. So, you got to understand that the first time you do this, it's harder. The second time it's easier. Now you look at, I Daniel and Martin, and the rate they're plowing through Western literature it's humiliating. It's intimidating because they just plow through this stuff. Well, the answer is once you've plowed through the first 10, right? I mean, all of a sudden it becomes easy. And doing it, doing it on audio is always better for most people, right? Because if you're in the car driving to work, doing an audio, or you're mowing the lawn or whatever, now you get to not have the problem of holding your focus,
Right.
struggling to hold your focus. Whereas when you're driving and whatever, there's a thing that holds your subconscious mind on what you're doing. Mowing the lawn is a great one for me, right? Not that I have a lawn anymore, but when I used to have acreage, it was a pain in the ass. That tends to make it easier. So when I said how to read, there's a book called How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler. And he has a simpler version of what I just said. For me, I really like when I read my work has taught me the universal pattern between all things. So when I read somebody today, it's obvious what they're going to say. Does that make sense?
Well, when you say that, does it mean that you can tell the arc of argument?
Yes.
It's like, oh, I can see where there's a deviation in the thinking from what is in this direction.
Yes.
And it leads to this.
I can almost always tell it from the table of contents. So if I read a table of contents, it's not stupid, which doesn't happen very often.
Oh, there's a reason. I want the audience to be aware. I caused Kurt to enter into this because I thought it would be useful to the fellows. To create the solution that eases the cost, the burden of absorbing information from books.
And so let's take the same guy, Adler.
Yeah.
He's a synthetic historian of intellectual history. He's the philosopher, but his approach was, he says, all of human knowledge can be reduced to 1,500 concepts, maybe 1,000. Here they are. He wrote a book on it called the Syntopicon.
Called the Syntopica?
Yeah, Syntopicon. And it used to come with
list.
It used to come with Encyclopedia Britannica, I think. I might be confusing it because it's been too long since I used to have it.
Yeah.
But he says there's basically only this many ideas. And he's right. And if you look at our work, you realize there's only this many first principles.
It's not that many.
It's not that many.
It's a lot less.
And so once you realize that, there's all these cognitive biases. My favorite one that I fight with all the time is that you think because you've discovered something you don't know, there's a lot more to discover, but it's actually the 80-20 problem, right? Is that one thing you learn is like 90% of all there is to learn about that subject, right? I mean, it's just sort of like that, right? And so what you realize by doing something like our work, which is this first principles, it's like, shit, that's explanatory power across the universe. And then you go to something like the Syntopicon, which is all the ideas, which includes the aesthetic on top of it, right? Because so I can learn all of human understanding. I mean, it's all learnable, right? And so then what you realize is there's like a handful of books which we list, and all the rest are nonsense.
Yes.
Right? That's what's terrifying. We produce so many books per year.
Honestly.
And that's
why I've hesitated to write. I'm like, I just don't have anything worth talking about. I'm not interested in writing more writing.
So what you discover is that every generation goes through a learning curve. Because nobody's reduced knowledge the way we have. Right? So every generation goes through a learning curve, explaining their experience in the current level of society and change and whatever, according to what they understand are some set of principles, but they never identify the first principles. So what you get is this pattern over time of people coming, redescribing the world my favorite, what's his name? Montaigne. Montaigne's Essays is a wonderful book. Another example of what happens when you take a Jewish guy and give him a Christian foundation, you tend to get the best of both worlds as the Jewish mind is applied to Christian ethics. So this guy comes out and Montaigne writes his essays. And, he's writing these in 1500, right? Well, I mean, what's the difference between those essays and today? Not a fucking thing, right? If you read Aristotle, one of the things that, a couple of us have discussed is, one of the interesting things would go back and apply P to Aristotle and rewrite Aristotle, which would show that he was basically, you'd have to take Epicurus and Aristotle, whatever, but is to take his writings and that were meaningful, basically the ethics, and take his ethics, right, and write it out. You would be surprised at how accurate it was. So we just do the same thing. We take the frame of our current age and the frame of our age within that age, the current context, and we describe local events, right, within that frame. But it turns out that it's the same shit over and over and over.
It's like this. There's only how many you said how many plots there are, right?
Well, there's one plot, which is change of state, but there's, depending on who you act, there's either one or there's 12 or there's 30. Right. I mean,
but it's a very limited number, and it's just drama at that point.
Right. And there's only so many archetype characters. But so what you do is you take these up, down, up, down, down, up, down, up, down, up, what's Cinderella? Down,
up,
down, up, right? I mean,
yeah.
down, up, down, up. So all of them, and then you take the archetypes, which is if you read Kurt Vonnegut's work, I think that was his thesis was in this particular thing. I just forgotten because it's been too long since I paid attention to it, but yeah, he wrote a thesis on it. So anyway, he works this up, and Vonnegut, of course, then goes to show in his career how accurate he is, right? But it's just like, here's the archetypes, right? Right. And there's certain, you get something like in Hindu civilization where there's like 5,000 gods, right? I mean, if there's a
going down this rabbit hole, are we?
Right. It's just genius. It's why I say they're genius. If there's a permutation of archetypes that can be used to fit an individual persona,
they have it.
They have it. Right. So they have an archetype that fits you somewhere. And that fucking
good luck finding it.
Well, it tends to be caste based, so there's probably a god for your role in your caste, which is fucking genius, right? Right. So, but there's only so many archetypes, and so if you realize that's going on, that's why we run out of. That's why you have to have a George R.R. Martin come along, or a Tolkien, is unless you exhaust the plots available in combination with the archetypes available in a genre. So you have to increase the character arcs, which is the transformation the character goes. In other words, you change the hero's hero's journey, which is George R.R. Martin. He shows that everybody's good and bad, right? That's his trick. And he makes these long character arcs that produce a different hero's journey for each archetype. Except he does it with like 100 fucking characters, right? And so Tolkien set out this thing, and before him, I can't. Who's the guy in the 60s that wrote those really long books?
Long book.
I just can't think of it. Anyway, you produce a lot of character. The only thing you do is add more characters over more circumstances, with more complex arcs, but I mean, you're still stuck with there's only 30 plots and so many archetypes, so it's just you got to make more because you can't find another alternative at this scale. So the only thing you can do is scale up complexity, which is why it's hard to make a movie today, because that's why they're doing all these replots and plots, is because we're producing so many movies that you were exhausting the plots in each given context. And so that one of the reasons they've gone to these degeneracy and extremes is because there's nothing more left there's no novelty to create.
There's no drama.
Right, which requires, and they need some reason to produce a novelty. So how to read a book, how to understand, yeah. So the point I was making with narrations, the story, is I was trying to show it's a math, just like,
Yes.
right? So I was saying the story is a constructivist logic that could be infinitely scaled, just like any other mathematics. Well, it's the same thing with chemistry, or same thing with physics. It's the same thing with economics, the same thing with technology, right? It doesn't matter because all these things work through recombinations of first principles, right? Once you've identified nouns, archetypes, and verbs, changes the state, you've only got context. So it's storytelling is just math, right? It's just, and so that's one of the beautiful illustrations you can use to show that the grammars from
Yep.
Logical consistency, inconsistency to math, to operations, to sense, to stories, right? That this whole thing is just the same thing. It's just math. It's just logic. Sorry, did I drag
That was good. That was good.
So you had one more, or no?
I did.
'Cause I have the one.
What?
I want to do Twitter when you're done. That's all.
Okay. Oh, I was going to ask you about this, which was this crazy function that has occurred. This is the first one on my list. It's just underneath the topic, and it's like it's just hiding. But it's like there's a interesting the conversation came up this week as well, which was that this is a deterministic function we've found ourselves in, with the illusion of free will. Now, how do we square this deterministic function with the illusion of free will with the sensation of heroics, which is like emblematic of Western civilizational arc of story, for individual arc of story? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know what you're trying to get at.
It's like there seems to be a dissonance between the two premises.
Yeah, it's because free will is a bad term, right? In other words, and determinism is a bad term as well. In other words, both of these terms refer to a spectrum, not a state. And so when you ask them in a philosophical context, it creates the illusion in your head that you're talking about states rather than spectrum. So the easiest one is to say, they're both the same problem, which is determinism is it absolute determinism or is it deterministic?
Okay.
And determinism it will produce finite states to finite states, and deterministic says it will produce probabilities.
Okay, so waveform versus a particulate.
Yeah, so you're talking about or you're talking about a line versus a distribution. So let's just start with probabilities. So deterministic means that things that no matter what you do, certain categories always result.
Okay.
That's different from saying certain states result.
Yep.
And so it's a complex, it's like you can't tell can I predict the movement of gas molecules deterministic? It's called hard determinism. Absolutely not. But is there deterministic? Absolutely.
Oh, right.
Right. Is the universe follow hard determinism, or is it deterministic? It's deterministic. It's like soft.
Right, because you can't predict the individual gas molecule's arc.
You can only say that certain trends will emerge, which is what we call stable relations, right?
Right.
Existing states. And so when we get to human cognition, certain things are softly deterministic.
Okay.
Right. So thoughts are softly deterministic within some range of knowledge. Right. But they're not determinable. Right.
Individually determinable.
Because the path to get there is quite complicated, even though the multitude of paths,
will tend toward a certain direction. So deterministic is different from determinable, right? And so the universe is deterministic, which means it produces categorical regularities that we can observe and name as states or verbs changes. In other words, the laws of thermodynamics, the velocity of mass, right? The recombination of different waves into stable states, right? So harmonic states. So those things are deterministic, but not determinable, because the number of variables at any given point mean that we can't tell what's going to happen to any individual piece of information, but we can tell what's going to happen to the set of information. So this is what quantum mechanics means. It means things happen at quantums, right? The quanta. So if there's 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, it takes a certain amount of energy to perform a certain stable state. Do we know what's happening to every fucking thing in there? No. Right? So when they say they're looking at waves, they don't know the beginning state or whatever. They can only describe the probability of the energy density. It's somewhere along this particular potential. They're just saying it's determinable. Excuse me, it's deterministic, but it's not determinable. Right? Well, the same thing is in your head, right? My head. We're going to come to this. You and I come to the same conclusion. God knows what neurons did that in our two different heads.
Right.
Right. All right. So it's the neural pathways, or the way we got there, might be deterministic, but it's not determinable. And so free will is a question of what's deterministic, right? In other words, what deterministic humans can achieve and mean in that sphere of actions which we hold each other morally liable for. So free will means you have their choice within what's deterministic by human behavior to do what's right and wrong. That's what free will means. Free will is part of a moral question, not a physics question. And by being a moral question, it narrows the categories of determinism. So when we say we have free will, we have the free will not to act immorally within our range of competency. Do we hold the children, young adults, young adults, adults? These are spectrum. We don't hold everybody the same standard because it's within your range of competency. Now we might, and so that's what free will means. You have the choice within your range of competency to attempt to act morally. Well, that's just that's a statement of aggregates, right? Of determinability, soft determinism, not one of hard determinism or determinability. Does that make sense? And so why this is fucking complicated is completely fucking beyond me. It's the question of free will is a question of, given the available information available to me, and given my knowledge of what's moral, can I act morally, choose to act morally versus immorally? Well, you can. I'm sorry. And is that deterministic or determinable? It's not determinable. In other words, the number of coincidental values at any given time surpass any ability to determine, including the structure of the universe, which we know it can only be deterministic because of the time, space, volume, whatever, and the way the quantum background is organized. If it was if the universe was hardly deterministic, it would be uniform. Instead of, there's strands of gases that resulted in galactic clusters, which resulted in galaxies with individual stars and planets, non-planetary shit in them, right? So if the universe were determined, were determinable, it would be uniform. Is that really true? I'm trying to say, I'm using that to illustrate my point, and I'm probably overusing it. It would not, the universe appears to have rules which are deterministic, but it doesn't look like those rules are determinable, which would be more uniform than it is. I'm going to get somebody to push back on me, and I'm like, dude, I'm trying to make a fucking analogy. All right.
All right.
All right. Does that make sense? So
I'm good with that.
Yeah. So yeah, you got the face of, I don't know if we actually solved that or not. You got what?
I don't. That's a hard one. It's like, no, I'm satisfied with that explanation. That was interesting.
You're confusing a question.
Two different dimensions.
Two different dimensions by asking the question.
That's kind of interesting,
right? And so it's an act of conflation, which is, I say, well, that's why you have to convert it to operationalism in order to disambiguate the conflation. So the question of free will is a moral question within the scope of what is deterministic behavior by people. You can choose to be immoral or moral depending on your scope of competency to do so, and that's not a question. We can choose that. Do you? Well, because we know you can choose to do one or the other, and we do. Right. Well, that's not a question. I mean, is the universe deterministic? Yes, it's deterministic. Is it is it determinable? Absolutely not. Right. It's not hard to determine.
There is the ambiguation of that term, determinism.
Right.
That's interesting.
So I always see it's all questions of philosophy are sophistry, as far as I can tell. All pseudo profound. If it sounds profound, or it sounds like it's not. Somebody's pulling.
It's cover.
It's cover. All right.
I think we've handled that one.
All right.
Now I'm ready to proceed to topic of your choice.
Twitter. Elon Musk and Twitter.
I like that he brought this. Did you see the pictures of him bringing the sink in?
Let it sink in.
I'm like, what kind of crazy genius does that?
Because he is.
It's like, it's just emblematic, right?
Yeah.
Iconic.
Well,
so what about it?
Well, I think I brought this up yesterday in the meeting, but I have the question of, there's a whole bunch of stuff to talk about. One is that what I'm beginning to question is the dominance of foreign nationals in our social media companies is producing a sensibility, a sense-making system within these companies that is unsuitable for.
It's alien.
It's alien, and this is, and I think this is probably a bigger problem than we imagine it to be.
So it's like bringing in just foreign nationals and putting them in executive positions,
right? And
in general.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, if the question is purely empirical and it's not social, I don't know if it matters. But the problem is we've brought people into our social media space, and because there's
wait, you mean participants?
No.
Versus corporate.
No, I mean, let me finish. We've brought people in to manage and work in technology companies that function as part of our political system, who do not have Western sensibilities. And so are we asking, in other words, you're bringing in aliens who feel alienated, who have intuitions that are quite different. And if you understand Indian culture, it's not as different as Islamic or Jewish or Chinese culture, but in Indian culture is much more conflict evasive than ours is. It's not. They don't have the problem of truth before face, but they do have the problem. They do prefer to avoid these kind of conflicts, whereas we demonstrate heroism by resolution of conflict over truth. So we're continually using heroism and reward for heroism as a means of maintaining truth in the commons, despite the psychological impact, burden that to our self perception and our status has on the participants in it. Except that what you don't realize is sort of like guys going to a joust, right? Those guys do to a joust and they're heroes and they're doing this joust, right? But all the people watching the joust learn. They don't have to participate, right? So in heroism, when we go out and we joust, we debate in the West, right? And we stick to truth before face, despite the harm, the psychological damage of impact to the dominance hierarchy. In other words, our self-perception and our status. We laud those people even if they fail. In other words, you're heroic even if you're wrong. That doesn't happen anywhere else. That doesn't happen anywhere else.
They just get trounced on.
Right. So because, but what we do is we flip that inside out. Is it and that's one of the reasons in debate, sometimes you're assigned to side of the argument.
Right.
Right. This is sportsmanlike conduct. Right. This is the whole idea, is that it doesn't matter. It's great if you win, you're better. But if you played well, that's enough.
Sportsmanlike, right?
It's the same thing with our military and our federalism. This important, subtle concept, but it profoundly affects Western civilization. If you're part of the Austro-Hungarians and I'm part of whatever, we could be allies in the next war. So sportsmanlike conduct, in other words, we might fight and win the fight, but it's not personal, right? We can both be heroes because we did our duty. So in the West, we are obligated to do our duty first before our duty to commons, before self and family. Does that make sense?
Yes.
We have to do duty to the commons before self and family, and we get status for doing that. And that's where our heroism comes from, and that's why the world cannot comprehend our heroism, because they can't comprehend that we've abandoned familism. What they call individualism, they've got backwards. It's actually commonsism. We're directing all dominance expression to the production of common goods at the expense of individual status. Except, what do? We give people status for doing that, right? So it doesn't matter if you got knocked off the horse because you were heroic. In other words, you did your duty for the common good. For some reason, that's alien, but we've forgotten we're a military civilization. In other words, we're organized as a military. Our values are military and militia.
Well, yeah, it's been trying to be washed out of us.
They're trying to wash us out of it. Whereas that's the reason that our classes can get along, and why Marx is wrong, is that the aristocracy, the burghers, and the church, the hierarchy of the military, the rule of law that's neutral regardless of rank, right? All of these things exist to preserve the ability of our people to act as one when necessary, and to receive respect for doing your duty regardless of your rank.
Right.
Now, you're supposed to get out of the way of the king and the monarchy and whatever else. But if you do your duty, you have honor. That's
and protection and respect.
And so that's how you buy in. That's why it was so important. What the Greeks did is they publicly made this citizenship by saying, I put the polity first. Right? That's what it means. Yet look at all these leftists. What they put themselves first, right?
Yeah, I have rights, I have privileges, or
so they want to be children, and we want to make adults. So I got lost there.
You were talking about Twitter and the introduction of alien influence within the corporate space.
In other words, I tend to, whenever I look at things, I'm like, what are the natural incentives so that I don't have to think about this as a conspiracy?
Wait. So I don't have to think about it as a conspiracy.
Right, because my intuition is like everybody else. They're evil, right? It's a conspiracy. But I try to say, how do I falsify my instinct? And so I'm looking at this, I'm like, well, I mean, there's a hell of a lot of incentives we're putting into this. Like I posted something the other day, and a bunch of Indian guys came back and said, well, we've only got a green card, so we can't switch jobs and do this other stuff because you're not citizens. It's a privilege to come and get a job. That's all. But you think you're acting like our government is the same as yours, or you're a full citizen. You're not until your loyalties are fully here. And what does it take to make your loyalties fully here? Well, some people, they feel pretty goddamn proud to be American, and they invest in it. And some people don't. Some people think it's a hurdle in order to get to stay. And some people think it's a privilege that they've earned. So I think about these Indian guys, and they're like, well, you're not getting it. Are you fully integrated yet? And you bear the same burdens as other people do? Well, no. Well, I mean, how long does it take for immigrants to adapt to becoming American in mind? Well, it depends on which culture you're from. If you're Jewish or Muslim, it might never happen. If you're Asian, it looks like it takes 3 to 4 generations, but it can happen in 2. If you're Hispanic, we don't certainly know yet, right? Because too many of them now. Because with too many, what you get is that it's easier to stay. In other words, it's easier not to adapt. It's like there are McDonald's you could go to, because I've seen this happen. I haven't been to it, but I've seen it, where they won't take your order unless you can speak Spanish, because nobody in there speaks English.
Wow.
All right, so it's too easy to not integrate if the numbers become too high. It's one thing to have a Chinatown, which is a ghetto, right? In other words,
right, a quarter.
Right, and there's one in New York too, which I'm forgetting. It's in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
The Russian one, which I can see in my head and I can't pull it out. I absolutely love it there. They don't seem to like us, but I love it there. So having a ghetto or a quarter is fine, right? I mean, that's different. But when you're there in large numbers and you're either intentionally or unintentionally still in your civilization's frame, you're not contributing to ours. So I'm just looking at this and like, I saw it happen at Microsoft with Indians.
Yep.
Who are the least problematic, possibly, because they're all these people that come over, they're from a certain class, and they're anglicized. Right? Never forget my first day of work at Microsoft, and this Indian chick shows up barefoot in a cotton dress I could absolutely see right through. And I'm like, what? And I'm sitting there in my suit. And I'm
Wait a minute.
like, what the fuck? Anyway.
Okay, so this is like this. I saw an article today, and I only read it was not today, it was yesterday, but I saw the title of it. It was quite interesting because it was kind of a variation on the dramatic theme. It was like the University of Oklahoma has a very woke agenda afoot, and they receive large influx of research grant money from the Chinese Communist Party.
Correct.
And it's like there's a conflict of interest here, because it's like, are they pushing this agenda as quid pro quo?
These are businesses, but this is the problem, of course, is this woke agenda or this diversity agenda has ended up harming our economy, it's harming our polity, which we've talked about in credentialism. But worse, it's actually harmed our research capacity, because the people who are graduating can't. Furthermore, it's baiting into hazard. Somebody asked me about this yesterday. I said, well, I mean, universities are using baiting into hazard. They're committing crime, which is they bring in a whole bunch of black kids and they create a debt for the 2 years before they fail out, and they profit for all that money. And then they use the money they profited from those black kids from taking gut courses that are all on entry level, which we don't need to take anyway, and they use it to pay for the research or the students or the administration. So I mean, it's fucking crime. Under the natural common law, what they're doing is called churning. It's a crime, right? It's intentionally baiting people into hazard. Whereas my view is, if you would let somebody into the university, and you take that money from them, you're responsible for their graduation, and you're responsible for their success. In other words, you're giving a diploma is a guarantee of performance. And you don't sit there and get to say, well, it's all up to them, because that's what it's led to. It's led to this nonsense. So, the fact that they tell you, well, it's a liberal education. No, it isn't. It's just more women have college educations. So they're saying that that liberals are smarter than conservatives. That's not the case. It's that more people have college educations. But we know that that the vast majority of women getting degrees, and actually many of those degrees are at guarantee they'll be making subpar incomes. Social science degrees, whatever it is. So they're not really degrees, but they call that as an IQ thing. Whereas, I guess a guy with the same IQ, he's going to go out and do the trades and he's actually going to make money. And it might take him longer to get them, but his peak might come later, but he'll get that. Whereas the girl out of school gets this stuff and she stays in administrative capacity. And this is causing all sorts of disruptions on the dating and marriage market as a consequence. So just universities are the whole credential catastrophe is just way out of hand. Well, I know you're the one that turned me on to this, talking about this. So this is my way of congratulating you on being right again.
I would like to take more joy in it, because it's just awful to it's like these giant wheels that are turning they have inertia, a huge amount of cultural inertia that are
they've
not
turned it
gonna turn around.
Right, they've turned it into indulgences. Right, the degrees become an indulgence. If it's not a STEM degree, it's basically a fee for getting a job, which that fee allows you to get a job even though there's no qualification difference in you, and that you've just mean that you've burned the ability to afford a house at an education that was simply a way for you to get laid for 4 years and drink beer. Party for 4 years. I'm all for partying, but let's go to long summer vacations so that we all go to Greek islands and violate the 100-mile rule so we can do our naughties. But let's not give up the whole fucking competitive value of the country by doing so.
There you go. That was some sage advice.
Anyway, so shit, I lost it again because I just got a message up here that distracted me. So
it's universities and research and degrees.
The university system has been funded by indulgences, specifically mostly funded by women, and it's the origin of the problem because it was easily captured by people who could pass credentialist tests, sell desirable falsehoods to people who were otherwise non-performant. So they could take jobs that are non-performant, in other words, nonsense jobs, and credentialist jobs, while at the same time they attach status to it so that people in demonstrated competency jobs could no longer compete for positions in the hierarchy.
Yeah,
so it's just a displacement issue.
That's it.
So that's a fixable problem. Kurt, that's a fixable problem if you have political power. Political power is easy for the demonstrated competence. You just have to show up. And they keep saying, well, you're saying that. I said, what makes you think there's any solution other than just showing up at 2 million guys? There's no fucking solution I know. Doesn't mean I'm going to try to pursue political solutions. But as far as I know, there's no, the political solution is only the attempt to obtain a political solution is just advertising for the fact that there's no political solution other than showing up with a couple of million guys. Because you're not going to get that many. You can't. The credentialist system is essentially a criminal organization that lives by rent seeking on the productive classes.
Well, and it has its own vested interests.
And they're not going to give it up. No criminal gives up crime without applied force.
They will never admit it's a crime.
Right. So
that was sobering.
Well, it's just how it is. What was the other piece of it? Oh, and then so the point I was trying to make about Twitter and whatever is if you have, I mean, basically a third of these tech companies are foreign nationals, right? Excuse me, 2/3 are foreign nationals, 1/3 are white. Of the whites that are there, they're hiring woke whenever they can, because 2/3 of the company are foreign nationals. So if you put a head of a foreign nationalist, I mean, it wouldn't matter if it was garbage collection, but it matters if it, in fact,
Social media control is coming through that site.
right. Well, it's the same thing for what Kanye was arguing with the Jewish control of media and entertainment. It's their competency, right? It's their natural competency because they're verbally, they're verbal people. It's a natural interest because they prefer attention, whenever possible. And so if you put those two things together, is they excel at credentialism, the verbal aspect of education. They excel at an incentive for getting attention, right? And they excel in homogeneity of interests. You're obviously going to get what you get. Okay, fine. It's not a problem. The thing is that we have the same effect in the media with the Jewish dominance of the media as we have in the alien dominance of the social media space. So why would we not expect that we'd have this problem? Of course we're having this problem. So we have and then we have in credentialism, we have the usual combination of white liberal women assisting in bringing into office the white liberal men who are a minority in the population, but become a large force in the political sector because white women are the only defectors among all races. I mean, and that's because the Jewish intellectuals have created a narrative that has baited white liberal women into the hazard of believing that undermining is progress, rather than the generation of irresponsibility that merely gets them access to more attention and status and self-image. That was I just did some
That
math.
was mathematical. I caught it.
That was math, right? It's not a question. It's math. So I go back to these media companies and it's like, well, let's just turn off the switch on tech workers.
What do you mean by that? That allowing the visas and such?
Send them over. So send them home. Move your tech workers back home, so they're not affecting our polity, and that's fine. It's all it does is drive up rents and costs for everybody in our urban areas, right? And it allows them to maximize cheap foreign labor instead of raise the cost of
local
domestic labor. And all it does is encourage misallocation of talent out of technology into other areas. And it's like, I saw the opposite in Ukraine, right? If you got a brain in your head, you go into technology because it's the thing you can most certainly make money at, and everybody goes into it. Well, I mean, if there's no reason people are in the financial sector today and they're going to get purged out, but a lot of those brains would do a lot better in the social sectors than they would in those, and because those sectors don't need to be parasitic. So I'm just looking at this and I'm saying, what's the consequence of having so many foreign nationals in these social media companies? And it's like, it creates, the culture is no longer European. It's East or South Asian. And those cultures don't value free speech at all. They do the opposite. In the case of Chinese, it's aggressively opposite. And in the case of India, it's subtly opposite. And
right,
so
and it's whitewashed with the woke women.
Well, I mean that, and that it's just hidden. I mean, if you just put these people up, I mean, with the way I said it, they're developing a state within a state, and so they're undermining us from within. So we're being undermined by the credentialist side, right? We're being undermined in the media by the Jewish side. And we're being undermined in the technology side by the alien side, and and then we've been hollowed out in the center by our own people shifting production overseas. So I'm like, yeah, it's pretty good war against our people under the claim that we're doing good, and we're not doing good. So I just look at it as, okay, well, are these people to blame? All right, well, they're acting according to their instincts and intuitions. I mean,
that's right.
That woman Vijaya or Vagina, whatever her name is, I always call her Vagina because whenever Vijaya, it's like just Vagina. That's why she goes by Vij or something like that because it's too obvious a
It's too
Freudian
easy.
slip to call her vagina. She's, I mean, when I saw her on Rogan, I wanted to strangle her because I just like, you're intrinsically evil. That's what I say. Men are bad, but women are evil. She's evil because she just doesn't know she's evil.
She thinks she's good.
You think she's good. That's, if you're the devil, that's what you do, right?
I wouldn't know.
I would, because I'm mean like that, and you're not. You're a nice guy.
Is that how it is? that was just backhanded.
So, the whole trick in forecasting is not to worry about whether something's moral or immoral until you've calculated all the potentials. So I don't limit myself to the moral immoral. That's probably why I see what the immoral is. So,
I'm with you.
never discount the fact that there are people who don't think morally.
That's right.
Or that their concept of moral is actually evil. So if you put Parag or whatever his name in and Vagina or whatever her name is in charge, I mean, I think you're going to get that outcome because the company isn't running by business and it's not a good business. It's not running off. It's certainly harmful to the commons, right? Which is certainly the case. Well, I mean, look at Facebook. Facebook is in the same problem. Right? They've become harmful to the commons.
What, PayPal did this thing too? They're gonna charge you $2,500 if they don't like what you said.
This is easily solved in court, which I mean, the first time it comes up, I mean, I'm gonna jump all over this because realistically, it's not. For example, if I get a fine for running over my minutes on my cell phone, right? First of all, that's immoral. You should be able to shut it off, right? You should shut it off.
That's right. You should be able to turn it off.
So I shouldn't be able to go over my minutes on my cell phone because what happened was the cell phone industry started making all its profit from penalties. So it encouraged plans that created penalties because penalties are more profitable than actual delivery of service. Well, the same thing is going to be the difference with Twitter. What Twitter is saying is there's no test. You can't know. I can't know what's
a priority.
And so they don't put would have to be established criteria that we could know. So if you're with PayPal and I'm selling like what's something offensive? I don't know. Thinking I'm selling vitamin scams or weight loss scams. What then if I sell mask scams, right? Or I sell let's say there was see, ivermectin is actually not a good example. What if there was it's like, what's that movie where the guy's selling some root or something as a prevention from getting the plague, right?
Okay.
I mean, it's a contagion. I can't remember what it's like some kind of root or something, right? Well, of course, now that's a real harm, right? It's not a psychological,
right?
It's a real harm because you're exposing people to risk, right? Or now, what happens when I disagree with I'm collecting donations though because I'm disagreeing with the mainstream narrative, or I'm disagreeing with a political narrative. Okay, now those are very different things, right? I mean, well, and so how do I know? Well, the problem is there's no way to know given the criteria, and there's and so that it's going to require us to go to court. So what we have to do with this, we have to kill it early. In other words, we have to take it to the court early as a meth, and that should be easy to win. That should be easy to win. We should have won the cell phone thing quite early on in Europe. They did. We should have won that early. There was a reason for it, by the way, because I worked on the early cell phone companies. Is that because the early cell phone companies were created by buying up all these little cell phone firms, they didn't actually know whether you're going over your minutes until like, I don't know, a month after. They didn't. This stuff just got rolled up and then reported later. Tell you, one of my developers put a hack into one of these systems, a backdoor for his bill, and they didn't catch it for like 10 years. And I didn't find out about it until they caught it.
So anyway, so how do we solve this? How do we solve this issue? And I think we need some legal work. The problem is it's expensive legal work. And, Facebook has a really great trick is that they make everything come into their jurisdiction where they basically own the judges.
Of course.
So we need to create a court for this the way we need an administrative court. Like one of the reasons we can't fix things is in Europe, under the continental law, they actually have an administrative court for taking the court to the state to court. We don't have one. Right. And so the thing is, if you take the state to court, the problem is they just run you out of money. Right. They wear you out of money. So you have to make it so that the state has to pay these fees, right? So that they can't. Right.
There was an idea that came up this week as well, which was that the gubernatorial candidate should investigate and prosecute media companies for attempting to propagate a preferred narrative for political control of the populace.
Correct.
And sue them for every damn dime they have times 3 treble damages.
And that's how things need to be done. We need to elect people that understand that that's what was used to undermine is the court system, and the only thing you can use to correct it. The difference is the court has now understood it has to correct for the past advocacies, which is why you're seeing these things come out of the court now. And so we actually have a court that will actually decide law, and so we can actually take these. The problem is that we have to fund these things privately. And so it's better if we get a state, right, like you're talking about, a governor to prosecute it, rather than require small private volunteer organizations to prosecute it, because the state just makes it expensive, because what they do is they run up the bill. That's how they get away with everything today, is they use procedural costs to bankrupt the individual.
Right.
What happened to January 6th people in all?
Oh my God.
They just use procedural economics to drive you out.
Yep.
All right. So have I covered that?
Economics. That was well covered.
I think the other aspect was just to reiterate that this isn't by idea, but in content moderation, there are 3 levels, 3 categories that I can't remember his name. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. He's been doing this since the 80s. Is you have decorum, what he calls decorum, which is there's just fuck you and the N-word, and that's a violation of decorum, right?
It's mean tweets,
right? It's a waste of fucking energy, right? Now, should those be suppressed? Probably. I certainly would like them suppressed. They're whatever. I called someone an idiot, and Twitter tried to get me to change my language. Right? The person was an idiot, but that's not a.
That's a descriptor.
That's a descriptor. Next, there's content, and you want to get rid of criminal content, child pornography, anything like that. Anything that's disgusting or revolting or illegal. Right? Offensive isn't the right word, but it has to violate the disgust response, which means it isn't a factor of an insult to your status or self-image. It's an insult to the fact that these things are violations of the commons. Right? So that's step 2. So they call that content filtering, and the first one being decorum filtering.
Right.
The third one they call something else, which I don't remember. Point of view. Right. So the difference in point of view is you have a point of view, I have a point of view, whatever. And no matter how much that point of view differs, no matter how disagreeable it is to either party, that doesn't make any difference, because that's like saying, excuse me. So that's just doesn't matter. So the hard part is, we can easily do decorum filtering and content filtering.
content filtering is actually a little harder because you got the image problem.
Yep.
It is possible to filter pornography, and so, I mean, I know it's not difficult. Although you can't tell the difference between some girls' photos and pornography. Sorry, I had to put that. It was just there. I had to. And then they went to content. I don't know how they do that without our work. The content, point of view, because I think it would be really valuable for all these posts to be tagged with what kind of argument they're using, sex bias, you know, political bias, moral bias, because you can tell all that stuff, right?
So you could add those tags as a separate service.
Yeah, but how do the
so that people could pay for that service to add the tag, so that will be an option that they could take advantage of.
I suppose that's the case, but I think the AI for it's no, it has to be, you really want to have it on the back end because of how this stuff is processed. Because that AI has got to be always, it's always in motion. So I don't think you can, you might be able to, I don't know. I would just see that as that's what they need to have. Because if you can tell, because the reason I like the tagging is that if I can do like explain this, I can see, I can learn from those tags.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's what the public needs. Does that make sense? The public needs to know this is.
So you need to sell it to Elon Musk.
I don't need anything else to do.
I know. I know you got other fish frying right now.
But I mean, that would be the answer is an AI that could do that. And so what I like about it is I want to be able to educate the public. And this is this political bias because it depends on these moral criteria and that's not hard to do. It's hard to, the way current AIs work, there's a lot of tagging labor ahead of time, but you basically make examples, right? And then you tag them, and then the AI learns from examples, the prediction. And the unfortunate part is tagging is still largely a manual process. In other words, the way you program an AI today is you take a data set and you tag it. And it learns from the combination of whatever image.
All potentials inside there.
Right, what it is. And then over time, it says, okay, what tags does this match? I mean, that's why I said it's really good. It's just intelligence is a question. It's just a different way of programming. Right. I said, because a Bayesian network is that's a bunch of measurements. And then they calculate a loss function, which says how far does this deviate from?
Right.
And so it's just a bunch. The math is hard, really. I mean, I'm not discounting the math, but what it's actually doing is kind of dumb. Intelligence. It's very precise statistical measurement, not intelligence.
Right.
All right. So we can have it. We can have that. Then he wants to make it a more like WeChat or whatever it is, which is he wants to make it a universal application, which is how he's planning to make money. The problem is the thing's going to lose has to pay $1 billion in debt a year to finance this deal. And Twitter's not that profitable. So he has to make it. Does that make sense? He has to
increase its value.
He has to increase its value, but he has to increase its revenue. And so that's the value. That's the reason to take it public. All right, to take it private is to get out of the problem of paying this cost, right, of development before the revenue returns in. But if he can make that thing anywhere near what I predict he can, it's going to print money like crazy. And Facebook's going the absolute wrong direction. I feel like I'm boring you today.
No, you're not. You're doing fine.
So So I have a topic for tomorrow.
Ah. Okay. You're
And
not
that's,
gonna disclose it?
well, I want to work on the summary.
Okay,
And because my, when I work on it myself, I try to put too much in, and I'm hoping
oh, I see.
you will say,
Summary, I got you, I got you.
you will say, these are the points we need to get across. I just want to walk through it.
Yeah.
Because, when I walk through it, I tend to want to put too much in. Then I want to discuss if it's the list. What I think is it has to be a table, and then I think we turn the table into a list. In other words, like everything else, it results in a table like the grammars,
Yes,
right?
That's good.
And so, but I don't want to, I want to do the lists first, so I'm not artificially messing myself up with in other words, I don't want the table to constrain my thinking. So,
correct.
so then I just want to go through the list first. So I just want to go through, okay, the formal logics, the physical, the formal, the physical, the behavioral, the evolutionary. And even within those, there's subsets. I just want to sort of break it up and say, okay, these are the first principles. And I want to say, we really need to talk about this here. We don't need to talk about that here.
Right.
Does that make sense? So if we could
So
do
is your
that,
progress going well?
um, the answer is yes. Yes, enough. What's happening is, it's just truth, which I've complained to you about, is I'm running out of gas too fast.
Right,
And so, if I can cover it with you, it will help me get through that. And I'm just figuring that it seems like the more time goes by, the better I'm getting.
okay,
And so, I'm extremely confident, but my work capacity for actually producing prose is still too.
you exhaust too fast.
I exhaust too fast, and I don't want to use so much of this that I drive my blood pressure up again. So I'm sort of, the only thing I know that will fix it is exercise, and so that's what I'm working on.
Good, man.
All right, brother.
I don't have a better plan. It's like that. I'll look for you tomorrow.
Thank you for today. Thank you for everything you do.
Pleasure, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Like, subscribe, bell, comment.
Notification.
I certainly gave you enough to think about today.
That's right.
All right.
We're looking for comments.
All right. Take care, guys.
See you, Kurt.